the books there. So, all right, now we're official. We're going to record this and post it. Thanks to Joe. I appreciate, Joe, you sending through some questions through the week, which were good. And I wanted to, before I touch on a few questions that came to me during the week that I thought I would hit on, my plan is next week, we're really getting into the design aspect of the system. So next week, I'm going to start doing some actual designs. We'll work through, sizing the system, sizing the wire, sizing the arrays, calculating the strings. So we'll start doing some of those kind of real world examples that, so I did get one submission from somebody who wanted me to do an evaluation of their home. If somebody out there has one that they want us to design their solar array for their home, just let me know. I just need to get a copy of your electric bill and your physical address so we can do up that design. Because I'd rather have a real world situation than just make up numbers. So that'll be, plus you'll end up getting a free design for your home. What the heck? So
So this is, hi, Fahim here. Hi. I have a question about the design thing.
Okay,
Is that
sure.
okay to ask right now?
Oh, sure. Fire away.
Okay. I've seen plenty of softwares that do a permit-ready design. Do we discuss that at some point, or?
We talk about it, but only vaguely, because at this point, let me go ahead and I'll leave it in speaker view, what the heck, or in gallery view. Yeah, because each program works slightly differently, but at this stage, I want you to understand the concepts behind what's happening when you use an automated system. A lot of the things get done sort of in the background, and if you don't understand why it's working that way, it can be a little bit problematic. But just as a bit of an aside, the program that I like to use when I'm designing a system that you guys might want to play around with is a program called PV Sketch. So PVSKETCH. And the nice thing about it is it's kind of a bare bones design program. It doesn't get you into all these. I mean, these things could get very deep and you'll spend a month just trying to learn the software. This thing is something pretty intuitive that you can pick up and work with. Plus, it's free to start with. If you want to generate a project, you can either pay them $4 for each one you do, up to 5 per month, or then you can go into a subscription situation. Some of these, like Helioscope, is it? Or it's one of those, it's Helio something. I mean, they can get very, very pricey, like $400 or $500 a month subscriptions. Now, if this is what you're doing for a living, fine. If you're doing 100 designs a month, that makes sense. But if you're just playing around, just getting started, there's another one called Open Solar. It's an Australian based, and it is 100% free. You can go straight on through it. It's a little more complicated, but that's another program that I would recommend you try. And it gets into some of the software. In fact, let me share the screen here since we're talking about this. Let me see if I can. You guys are probably seeing. Let me look at. Oops. Are you guys seeing my screen here? It says PV Sketch login. Is that what you're seeing? Somebody?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, you need to provide. So the way that it works, I'll just open a recent one. Oh, this may be a little more complicated than I wanted to get into. This is the software design here. And so if you, let's say we wanted to look at this particular location, you just simply punch in a number or, you know, an address. It's going to bring the thing in. Let's say I want to go ahead and install a second array. You just take this tool and you just on the image of the property, draw it in. I've already preset which panels I'm using, which inverter I'm using, and then I can just simply define the area and then tell it to generate the design, and it'll populate that area that I just highlighted with solar panels. Tell me how many will fit in there. It will tell me what my system size is, what my annual production is. So a lot of these things are then become just automated. So it's quite clever little thing. If I go back out here to this one was one that I didn't finish, but you can see a design here. I'll jump back through the proposal. This was one that actually had 4 arrays on the site. But if you want to see what kind of proposal it ultimately generates, let's see, is it still? I don't know if it's spinning or what it's doing. Some of my screen is covered over. There we go. All right. So this will show, you can get the proposal. It'll show you the design, where the arrays are going to be on the site. It'll tell you how many panels, how many inverters, what the annual production is. If you plug in their utility bills, it'll show you how it's generating versus what it's producing. It'll tell you how much of the use that particular design will generate, tell you some average savings. This particular unit, it's saying, is a 2.5-year payback based on energy production. And part of the reason for that is I've put in all of the incentives that are available, and it's $117 initial, or $117,000 initial cost, but $94,500 in incentives, tax incentives and things like that. We can get into some of the very specifics there, but the incentives that these guys would qualify for, because they're an agricultural business, is REAP. The USDA has a 40% tax credit. So 40% of it could be paid for through this REAP grant. Then they would qualify for a 30% federal income tax credit, which everybody qualifies for. And then because it's a business, you can deduct or depreciate it out fully in the first year. And what's interesting with the law is the depreciation applies even, it applies to 50% of the tax credit. So you can depreciate money that you didn't spend, which is kind of weird accounting. But anyway, bottom line is, for that $117,000, the upfront cost is going to be $22,500. So at this moment, the incentives are pretty dramatic. So,
hey Jay, how much?
Yeah.
What's the kilowatt size on that?
Was it? I don't remember. Let's see. I've got it here on my screen still. Kilowatt size was 39 kW. Yeah, it's 39 kilowatt for that array.
Okay.
And I think I had plugged in a $3 a watt price tag on it. So that's the 39,000 times 3 ended up being the 117,000. And $3 a watt is pretty average at the moment for smaller systems. We did see the price drop down for a system that size. A year ago, I probably would have priced at about $2.50 a watt. But supply chain has caused the prices to tick up just a little bit. Okay. One of the things that I wanted to touch on, one of the questions that came up, and it comes up quite often, and let's see, I'll get to the whiteboard here, is when you talk about sizing for ampacity, and typically in a grid tied array, you're going to have the solar array up here, and then we're going to go into a combiner box or a junction box. So let's say that we've got multiple strings that are being connected together in a combiner box. So let's say I have 3 strings coming in, and from that combiner box, we'll oftentimes near the array have some sort of DC disconnect. If it's a ground mounted system, you're going to want to put the DC disconnect out there at the array. But, you know, if it's a roof mounted system, you often don't want to have a disconnect up on the roof because it's difficult to get to unless it's a flat roof, like a commercial property or something like that. So you don't have to have 2 of them, but sometimes you do. And then we're going to have a second DC disconnect down here. And this DC disconnect has to be located within 10 feet of the inverter. Now, with today's market, usually that DC disconnect is going to be integrated into the inverter unit itself. So you just connect into that DC disconnect. But for this case, I'm going to talk about it as 2 separate things. Then this is going to be your inverter. And from the inverter, you're going to go to an AC disconnect. And that AC disconnect has to be located within 10 feet of the electric meter, typically, the point of connection, you know, the interconnection point. Usually that's going to be the electric meter. And it has to be clearly marked. It has to be externally operable, and so that people can turn it off. And then from that AC disconnect, we're going to do, in this example, a load side connection, and that's going to connect into our service panel. This is the main. From there, it's going to go to the meter, and then from the meter, it's going to go out to the grid, to the transformer up on the pole. So everybody familiar or see what I'm talking about with all these different component bits? This is a standard grid-tied string inverter system. Now, the question I wanted to get into here was, how do we determine the ampacity requirements of the wire coming from the array? And the way we determine that is, well, you remember that when you hook things together in series, amps stay the same, but voltage increases, right? Everybody remember that from chapter 4? So the ampacity that we're going to worry about for each string is going to be the ISC of one panel, because regardless of how many panels I hook together in a string, the amps are going to remain the same. They're going to be whatever the amps were from a single panel. The voltage is going to increase, but the amps remain the same. The ISC is the theoretical maximum amperage at standard test conditions. So let's say the panel we've selected has an ISC of 9.68 amps. And it might have an IMP, like where it's actually producing, might be 8.9 amps. Somewhere in there. The ISC is always going to be more than the IMP because that's the theoretical maximum. So the number we're going to use is the ISC in wire sizing. So each of these strings has an ampacity possible of 9.68. Okay, because amps don't increase when we hook them together in a string. So I take that number, and the NEC requires that when we're sizing wire, we always multiply it times 1.25. So I'll let somebody with a calculator, since I don't have that many hands, what is 9.68 times 1.25? Shout it out.
12.1.
12.1 amps. Now, if we're doing just regular wiring, we'd be done. But because of the variability of solar, we have to multiply this times 1.25 again. That's the solar variability factor. And the reason for that is this 9.68 was determined based on STC. And STC says there's 1,000 watts per square meter. But the sunlight, I've done measurements out in the field where I've gotten 1,200 watts per square meter. You know, at the edge of the Earth's atmosphere, the solar constant is like 1,360 watts per square meter. So on a really clear day, you can get more than 1,000 watts. So in order to deal with the variability of sunlight, they're saying, you know, it's possible you might have another 1.25 increase. So let's take the 12.1 times 1.25, and we get
15.1.
15.125.
15.125 amps. All right. So if I'm coming into a fuse or a circuit breaker in my combiner box, what size circuit breaker do I need? See, you're fine to give me calculator answers, but now I'm starting to get into understanding here. So anybody want to venture a guess?
20 amp.
20 amp. 20 amps, exactly right. Why? You round up to the next commercially available sized breaker. In theory, we could go with a 15 amp because we've got a lot of fudge factor in here. The only problem we would run into is you might get some nuisance tripping, where it might trip when it's functioning properly. But the code inspector should not approve a 15 amp breaker because that's not what the code says. So we'd have to go to a 20 amp breaker. Well, in theory, we'd have 3 20 amp breakers in here, right? Or maybe 6 if it's a transformerless inverter and we've got to break both the positive and the negative. Okay, so we're going to have a 20 amp breaker in here. From here, what is the ampacity rating of the wire? What's the ampacity that we have to make sure we get? Draw it a guess.
Would it be based on 20 amps and higher?
Now, actually, what we're doing, we figured out that each string was 15.125. We've got 3 strings being connected in parallel. So we just take that times 3.
45.
45.375. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Okay, so we need now wire that can handle 45.375. So you would look up in your table, I forget which page it is, like 104 or something like that. Each
You got
edition.
that. 104.
What is 104?
10. Yep.
Hey, what do you know? That's really sad that I remembered that. So, all right. So then you look up in there, and anybody looking at that table at the moment, what size wire do we need?
This is more just a guess, but it should be like 6 or 8 gauge.
Yeah, I think 6 gauge. Is that right? Let me grab got a copy of the book right here.
If you're using TW wire.
Yeah, and that's one of the points I wanted to get to is the table is broken into columns, and the ampacity rating of each wire is different depending on the type of wire you're using. So in column 1, we have TW or UF. And if we use 8 gauge, it's rated for 40 amps. But if we use 6 gauge, it's rated for 55 amps. But if we go over and get a higher temperature wire, for instance, we could do THHN or THHW, and then we've got 50 amp rating for the same 8 gauge wire. Okay, so would we use 8 gauge wire and just go with a high temperature like a THHN? If that's in the third column, that has a rating of 55 amps. Well, in theory, you could do that. But one of the recommendations that I will make very strongly here is you only take the ampacity from column 1, regardless of what kind of wire you're using. So even though if we're using THHN and it says I have an ampacity with 8 gauge of 55 amps, I would take my reading from the first column, which means I got to go with 6 gauge wire, not 8 gauge wire. And the reason for that is the ampacity rating of your wire is not just the ampacity rating of the wire, but it involves the connection points of each piece of equipment on both ends of that wire. So I'm connecting into a combiner box, and in this case, I'm connecting to a DC disconnect. Well, each of those connection lugs that you're going to hook into has its own temperature rating. You know, is it rated for 60 degrees Celsius, which is what that first column is? Or is it rated for 75? Or is it rated for 90? Well, if it turns out that both lugs are rated at 90 degrees Celsius, then you could go with column 3 with the higher rated wire, but you might change out that DC disconnect in the future, and you don't know what the rating of that lug will be. So if you go with the lowest temperature rating of the wire, you're always going to be safe, regardless of what piece of equipment you connect on either end of it. All right. Have I confused anybody with this?
Yeah, that's good theory.
Yeah, because, you know, first off, when you're designing the system, you probably don't even know what equipment you're going to be attaching to it. You know it's going to be a DC disconnect, but you haven't picked it out yet. So if you go with the lowest one, it not only deals with your design, but it also deals with future changes, and you're going to be safe. But you're going to spend a little bit more money on wire. That's always problematic. It didn't used to be that such a big expense, but wire is getting super expensive. You know, got to mortgage your house for wire anymore. I was just as an aside, I had wired from our solar array up to the garage or to the barn. And when I went and got it, was 2 gauge aluminum. So it was the 3 conductor 2 gauge, just service entrance wire that you get for regular utility, 100 amp rating. And I had measured the distance, but I hadn't accounted for the fact that it goes 3 feet down into the ground on both ends, you know? So I ended up with a piece of wire that was 4 feet too short to go from where I was going to where I was going. And I had paid about $100 for it, for this 90-foot piece of wire. And 2 gauge wire like that is pretty cumbersome. So it'd been laying around underfoot for a couple of years. And I decided, I had a friend who was an electrician. I said, I've got this 90-foot piece of wire. You guys, you want it? Could you use it? And he's like, sure, I can always use wire. So I gave it to him. Anyway, I'm working on another project and I need a 90-foot piece of 2 gauge wire. I went out and I priced it $7 a foot for that stuff now. So I'm realizing I gave that guy a $600 piece of scrap metal that now I'm like shooting myself saying, man, I should have held on to it. All right. So anyway, wire's gotten expensive. All right. So everybody understand that we need 45 amp wire here. which is in this case going to be 6 gauge. What size wire are we going into the combiner box with? Well, it's the wire that's connected to the solar panels. And in today's world, those pigtails that you get is pretty much always 12 gauge. 12 gauge wire coming in. So that has an ampacity rating when I look at my table of 25 amps. So 25 amps, you know, in the world that we're dealing with, that's more than enough that we ever have to deal with. Now, just to run this further on down the road, what's the gauge wire after the DC disconnect? What are we looking at?
It should be the same, right?
Yeah, nothing changes, right? It's just a disconnect. So we're going to go with 6 gauge here. After this disconnect, we're going to go with 6 gauge. Now, after the inverter, well, at this moment, you don't have enough information to determine that, but everything changes at the inverter, right? Because no longer are we coming in with whatever this might be. This might be 600 volts DC coming in here. Well, now it's probably going to be leaving here at 240 volts AC. So because the voltage is changing, the ampacity is going to change as well. So typically what you'll do here is we'll just look at the inverter specifications. And if the inverter says I have an output maximum of, say, 30 amps, then I'll take 30 amps times 1.25 because we always have to do the NEC. And because I'm starting all over, I've got to put in the correction factors or the variability factors. So at that point, 30 times 1.25 is
37.5.
37.5. All right. Now, because it's now gone through an electronic device, I don't have to worry about the variability of solar anymore. You only deal with the variability of solar until you get to the first electronic device, because after that, the signal is mitigated. So at this point now, this is our rating. So I could go out and I can put in 8 gauge wire, which is rated for 40. And then I go through the process and I connect up. What size breaker would I put here in my main distribution panel?
$40 amp.
40 amp. That's exactly right. Round up to the next available breaker.
Also, I do apologize, but how did you get the 30 amps coming out again? Sorry, I missed that.
I said that I'm looking at the specifications of the inverter, and I just made up a number. I said, all right, the inverter is saying its maximum output is 30 amps. So if that's
Okay,
the case, well, we could figure out what size inverter that would be. Is if it's 240 volts, 30 amps, then we're going to be, is that right?
8.
7,
Oh,
8?
wait.
Did I do it
Oh,
wrong?
nope, 7.2.
7.2?
Yep.
All right. See, I believe you guys. All right. So this would be a 7.2 kW inverter. In reality, it's probably going to be a 7.8 inverter. Why? Well, this gets to another interesting thing. Notice I came into this inverter or into my service panel. Well, I don't know if we've gotten there yet in your readings, but let me touch on this since we're there. How much can I connect into this service panel? So let me clear this screen. Not so used to where is my controls here. I don't see my controls. All right, I can get a new screen. Okay, so I'm coming into my service panel. Here's my main. Here's where I want to hook up. Well, the first thing you need to know is in a service panel, you always want to locate your solar array's input as far away from the main as you possibly can. Normally, your main's going to be up at the top, so you want to go down here to the lower left or the lower right-hand corner. You want to be as far away. You want your two inputs into that on opposite sides of the bus bar. All right, so let's say that I'm coming in here and the service I'm getting from the grid is 200 amps. So this is fairly typical in a home. It might be 100 amps, but more and more typically it's going to be 200 amps. And I look at the panel, the service panel, and it's telling me in the little specifications that's on the door that this panel's bus bar is rated for 200 amps. So I've got 200 amps coming in from the utility, and the rating of the unit is 200 amps. So how much can I put into this? What size array can I install and connect into this service panel? Well, logic would tell you that it's already met its capacity, right? 200 amp rated panel with 200 amps coming from the utility, I can't connect into it. But the NEC says from an auxiliary source like a PV array, they call it the 120% rule. I can actually go to 120% of the panel's rated maximum. So that means I can come in here with a 40 amp breaker, right? And the logic there is that you almost never run all of the power. You know, how many people have popped their main because they ran too many electronic devices in their home? You know, it happens very, very rarely. So I could come in with a 40 amp array or with a 40 amp circuit for my array in a 200 amp panel. So from here, I'm going to leave out the AC disconnect, but I'm going to my inverter. Everybody with me so far? I don't want to lose anybody along the way. All right. So if I've got a 40 amp circuit, a 40 amp breaker, what is the maximum output from the inverter that I can hook up to that 40 amp breaker? Let's assume it's a 240 volt AC system. It's not three phase, it's single phase. Well,
would that not just still remain at the 40 amps?
Yeah, but I want to know how many watts, what size in wattage could I put my my inverter, because inverters are rated in watts typically. So what's the biggest inverter I can hook up under this system?
That would be 9,600 watts.
9,600? And you got that by doing what?
Multiplying voltage by amperage.
Yeah, watts equals amps times volts, right? So 240 times 40 gives me, everybody agree, 9,600? So in theory, I can put a 9.6 kW inverter, but I can't. Why? Because we have to derate this by 1.25 because the amperage, we're putting a 40 amp breaker, but we can't run 40 amps on a 40 amp breaker because we have to have the 1.25 safety margin. So if I divide, well, let's divide 40 by 1.25 just to see what our output in amps would be.
32.
32 amps. So the maximum output from my inverter can be 32 amps to hook up to a 40 amp breaker. Otherwise, I'd have to go with a 45 amp breaker or a 50 amp breaker, you know, because we have to factor in the 1.25 safety margin. So now if my inverter is outputting 32 amps, but it's still at 240 volts, now what's the size?
7680.
7680. There you go. So as a result, this is really the maximum size inverter that I could hook up under this system, doing a load side connection to a 200 amp service panel with 200 amps coming from the grid. As a result, when you start going out and sizing inverters, what is the most common size inverter you're going to run into? It's a 7.6 kW. What's the next most common size? 3.8 kW. Why is that? That would be a situation with 100 amp service and a 100 amp rated panel. That's the second most common situation you run into out there. So these numbers at first glance seem weird. Why would people go out and sell a 7.6 kW? Why wouldn't they just sell an 8 kW or a 4 kW? And it's because of this 120% rule here with service panels.
Can we discuss, sorry, I kind of don't understand why 40 amps came through 120% rule.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, under this scenario, we're saying that it's a 200 amp rated panel.
Yes.
With 200 amp service. Well, what is 120% of 200 amps? So if I say 200 times 1.25, 1.240.
Yeah.
Okay, so 200 is coming from the utility, 40 can come from my array.
Okay.
That's where we got the 40.
Oh, I see. Okay. I get that now. Okay.
Yeah, now if I had a generator coming in here and it was a 20 amp generator, well, now I could only come in with a 20 amp from my array because it's all the inputs combined could only meet 120% of the service.
No, quick question for you, sir.
Uh-huh.
If you had a situation where like the solar is like a backup in case the power goes out, would you not then have both the main power and the breaker for the solar on one to where only one could be on at a time?
Yeah. Yeah, the way that typically works, and now what you're talking about is like an AC coupled or a DC coupled system. And typically
Yes,
what that's going to do is you're going to have your array, you're going to come into a junction box or a combiner box, going to go to your DC disconnect. From the DC disconnect, let me see, I've got a, let's do a very simple one, a DC coupled system. And in this DC coupled system, this is my inverter. And in the inverter unit, I've got a battery bank hooked up and it connects into this inverter unit. And from the inverter, I'm going to go off to my main here, which is going out to the meter and then out to the grid. And from here, I'm going to go to a critical load panel. Okay, and so some of my circuits are going to be output from this panel, the non-critical circuits, the ones I don't care about if the grid goes down, like hopefully my garage door opener and maybe the bedroom outlets or something like that. Here we're going to hook in like our refrigerator, our freezer, our well pump, our, outlets in the kitchen, whatever you've determined as being critical. Now, within here is an auto disconnect switch. So there's a sensor wire that's sensing. Now, assuming the grid is up, power is flowing through here and it's going to this breaker box. It's going to this breaker box. It's flowing through both of them. If I have enough power from my array, it's servicing here. If there's more power than I need, it's going out on the grid. If I don't have enough power, some of it's flowing this way, some of it's flowing this way. I can set things up where I can use the battery if I needed to, that kind of thing. But under the scenario where the grid is operational, power is flowing in all directions to all power. As soon as this unit senses the grid has gone down, it disconnects. So when everything's operating, it's going here and it's going here. But as soon as it realizes the grid is no longer operational, it's going to disconnect this connection point. Now the power is only flowing into the critical load panel. That way you can't backfeed the grid. There's no islanding that'll take place. And the array will service this. If it needs power, it'll pull some from the battery. So the battery will act like the grid now as a backup. If I have more power than I need, the array is going to fill up the battery. If I have more power than the battery's full, the loads are being serviced by the array, well, then it just stops producing because there's no load for it to go to. So that's a opportunity cost, but no problem. Then as soon as it senses the grid has become reestablished, it's going to make this connection again. And now all of the lights, all of the outlets work again. So
Now,
that's
quick
a
question.
pretty common DC coupled system.
Now, in this scenario though, like if the grid is active and your solar isn't like it's a dark day or something like that, and it doesn't have enough backup to supply those critical power loads, would it still feed from the grid?
Yes.
Or would those loads not work?
No, if the grid is functioning, the power will flow, to here from the grid. It'll flow from here to the grid. It'll go wherever it needs to go. Power always flows to the lowest, least path of resistance. I always like to think of it as water finding its level, and if you turn on something here, it's like you've lowered the level a little bit and water will just flow in. So electricity will just flow in from whatever source is nearby to bring it up to where it needs to be. Of course, once the grid is disconnected, then the grid is no longer reliable. Well, then, you're only going to be able to rely on your batteries and your array. So that's when you get into sizing and make sure you've got enough battery capacity to service those loads for as long as you think you're going to need to service those loads.
Okay, yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, now one of the newer things that we're dealing with a lot, let's see if I can get this pen all the way down here, and this is a system that I'm just about to install here at our office, is I'm going to use a microinverter system. So when you're using a microinverter system at the array, you've hooked up little microinverters to each one of these panels. So the output from the array is not DC, it's 240 volts AC. Right? So all the way right from the array, we're only dealing in the world of AC. Well, that can be a wee bit problematic if you want to incorporate batteries, because batteries are DC rated. So I've got to take my power from the AC, convert it to DC to charge my batteries, but then I've got to convert it back or invert it back from DC to AC to use it on my loads. So that's an AC coupled system. It used to not be very practical because we're making basically 3 conversions of power. You're going from DC at the panel to AC at the inverter, at the first inverter, and there's going to be a loss. Then you're going from AC, converting it to DC to go into the battery. There's an additional loss. And then from the DC battery to AC again, you've got to go through another inverter. So 3 different conversions. And when it used to take 10% to make that conversion, you'd lose 30% of your power. So it didn't make any sense. But now the inverters are getting so good, you're really only losing 2% or 1.5%. So now AC coupled are a thing. So the system I'm going to be running here is it goes from here and goes to a with the Enphase system, they call it like a smart switch. but it really is just a auto transformer or an auto transfer switch. So I'm going to connect my solar array into this. I'm going to connect a battery bank into this. Now, the battery bank with this particular unit has microinverters built into it. So it can take power, AC power, and convert it to DC, and then it also takes the DC power and converts it to AC. Excuse me. So the battery bank is more than just batteries. It actually has inverters with it. Now, the other thing we're going to hook into is my electric vehicle. See if I can draw something that looks like a car, sort of. So I've got my charging station here as a battery bank. So in reality, I may not even need this. And then from this, it connects through the grid. The grid connects into this. And then from this switch, it goes into my service panel. So in this case, I don't have any critical load panel at all. It's a whole house system. All right, so how does this function? And see, I can also hook in a generator if I needed to. Here, it has a place for it. So when everything's functioning properly, the grid, the array is coming in. It's being switched all to my loads. It can also be switched over and be charging my electric car. Could be charging batteries if I needed to. So then from here, this is the grid. If I have too much power, it's going to send it out to the grid. Then as soon as it loses sight of the grid, it's going to disconnect here. And now everything operates independent, like a standalone system. And I can use the battery backup from my car to run my home if I need to. Now, the other thing it does is the battery through this smart switch will send a signal to the array and tell it that the grid is still functioning. It will confuse the array into thinking the grid is still functioning, so these microinverters don't shut down. Because of anti-islanding, as soon as those inverters lose sight of the grid, they just turn off. So I need something to tell it that the grid isn't down. Well, it's going to use power from my battery or power from my car to convince it that the grid is still functioning. And so now I'm in standalone mode. And that works. So this is kind of the AC coupled world that you're moving into when you're installing microinverter systems. And if you do this for a living, you're going to find about 50% of your installations are going to start looking like this. You're going to incorporate electric vehicle charging stations that serve as battery backup for the home. And that's going to be quite a dramatic shift in how our world works. Because, for instance, the Ford Lightning that just came out last year, it has 132 kilowatt hour battery in it. To give you an example, the Tesla Powerwall is a 13 kilowatt hour battery. So it's basically got 10 Tesla Powerwalls built into this car. The Chevy Tahoe that's coming out this year has a 200 kilowatt hour battery. Well, if the average suburban home uses 30 kilowatt hours a week or a day, which is what you hopefully learned in chapter 1 or 2, that's going to run the average suburban home for a week with zero power input, without any conservation of energy at all. So, once you start conserving energy and you start incorporating an array into this mix, because you're replacing some of the power during the day that you're using, a Chevy Tahoe hooked up to a system like that can basically run forever. It's a standalone system effectively. So So we're getting into that reality where if the grid makes life too difficult, let's say AEP decides to make your life miserable, or First Energy or whatever, just say, I don't need you anymore. I'm going independent. My argument is that the utility grid needs to now give me a reason to connect more than just getting power. I need some other service from them that will allow me or incentivize me to connect to them. And that's kind of the next great frontier. I want free Amazon Prime, when I hook up to the grid, or, and it kind of makes fun of that. I mean, just as an example, right now, when I sign up with Verizon, I get Disney Plus. Now, what's that all about? It's no longer just providing me phone service. It's providing me with entertainment services. It's now Verizon is not a phone company. It is it's selling me bandwidth services. So the utility company has to be an energy services company. There is an advantage of being interconnected. That's why we have the internet for communications. Well, there will be advantages of being interconnected with electricity. Already some companies like home security systems want to get into it so they can monitor not only your home, but your data usage. Are your appliances working properly? I can monitor right down to, is your refrigerator using more power than it did last month? Does that mean something's starting to go wrong? Do you need a new refrigerator? I'll recommend one for you. These are all services that things are going to start piling up on us. And so that's going to be an interesting thing where we need to start looking at the grid as a connected communication device for energy services. It will no longer be just a way to get power, because we can do that on our own now. We're right now, 2023 is basically the year of grid parity for energy generation plus storage. Right now, I can put in an energy generating and storage system that will cost me the same as just hooking up to the grid. That happened in 2012 for energy, but now I've got energy and storage in there. So now I don't need the grid. So what does that mean? Well, who are going to be the big players in the energy industry over the next couple of decades? It's not going to be First Energy. It's not going to be AEP. The companies that are jumping in now to become your utility provider are Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Intel, Google, Facebook, all of those companies I just mentioned, Walmart. They have all registered to be utility companies. They are approved by the Federal Energy Commission, the FEC, to be energy companies. I mean, imagine Apple. They're in a position where they could say, you know what? You're over generating power from your solar array. Your utility company is sort of, jerking you around, not paying you what you want to get. Tell you what, I'll put you into the iPower marketplace, and other people can buy your power from you at a reasonable rate, and you no longer need to worry about AEP or First Energy, because Apple bought 10% of the electrical grid, and now you're on the iPower network, and you can sell your power. I have excess power, I'll sell it to Hunter. Hunter has excess power, he'll sell it to Daniel. How much are you going to pay for it? I don't know. What are you going to, how much you offering, and you create a marketplace that way. I will make this prediction that within 10 years, the largest utility company in the United States will not own a single power plant, will not own a single mile of electric wire, and will have nothing but administrative staff. There will be no infrastructure whatsoever. It will be a virtual utility, and it will be mammoth. That is where we're going to. That's That's where Hunter's going to make his billion, right? Go out and start yourself a virtual power plant. You be the eBay. I mean, think about it. eBay's not eBay, but PayPal, largest financial institution in the country, right? It doesn't have a place you go. There's no bank. It's all virtual, you
Mhm.
know? I mean, why not? So that's where we're headed.
I had a quick question
Sure.
with respect to your example and something we talked about last week as far as the car batteries go. Are we still waiting on clarity about how they're going to handle warranties if you do this to a
Details,
to a system like
details,
that?
details.
Buy a new ointment,
Yes.
maybe?
Yeah. And we're still worrying about protocols. You know, will all of these cars still deal with the same kind of protocols in the charging and discharging? They're moving towards uniformity with these protocols. For instance, Tesla just announced they're going to let other vehicles hook up to their charging stations for the first time. We're kind of down to 2 or 3 major protocols worldwide as far as charging. Discharging still a different world. The thing I have trouble understanding, I've got a plug-in Toyota Prius. How are they going to know that I've hooked in? You know, I mean, it's kind of unenforceable.
Yeah.
At least as far as as you know, they might put in some some blockers in their system or something, but that just makes them difficult, you know, from a consumer standpoint. I don't see them wanting to do that. Right now, the only one that's really universal and does approve for discharge as well is the Nissan. Nissan has the Leaf and all of those. They say, yeah, fine, do it. You know, they're sort of throwing themselves wide open to that. Volkswagen announced that starting this year, they were going to allow for it as part of their thing. So I think slowly, it's going to be one of the sales points. I mean, already Lightning is saying that when they advertise, that's their whole shtick, but you got to use their proprietary charging station, you know? Well, that's fine. And that's another issue to be concerned about, is because their proprietary charging station is 80 amps. So you've got an 80 amp appliance now in your home. Well, if you've got 100 amp service coming into your home and you've just added an 80 amp appliance, you better upgrade your electric. And so we did a program on Solar Noon Tuesday a few weeks ago, basically wondering if 400 amp service to the home is not going to be the new norm, because you get somebody with 2 of these Lightnings in their garage. Now they've got 160 amps charging their vehicles, plus their 200 amp normal loads, you know, and now you're converting gas furnaces to electric heat. And so we may see the 400 amp service is the norm to the homes. Okay, any other questions, since I've been waxing poetic here for the last little bit?
Just because, as you mentioned, the 400 amps service is becoming normal to the homes. Do you think they will go away from the 120 residential and go up to like the 240 or 480?
That sounds, you know, 120 outlets, there's such an embedded base of appliances. It seems difficult to conceive that they'll do that. 240, I mean, obviously in resident or in commercial systems, we see a lot of 480 3-phase or you know, 208 3-phase. So I don't know. I don't see that happening. The 240, 120 split phase, single phase is pretty well embedded, but I think, you know, I've wondered before why we don't have DC outlets in our home versus AC outlets. I mean, that was a thing especially if you got solar, but half of your, or more than half, all your electronics are DC based anymore. Anything with a battery in it, your laptop, your electronics, your LED lighting, all of that's DC based. That has kind of become a moot point because the conversion between AC and DC has gotten so efficient that it really makes no difference. So I don't see that changing personally, but I've been wrong before, you know.
Sir.
Yeah. Anybody else have anything else? Okay, so next week we'll go ahead and start jumping into some of the design programs. But if you do have any questions, and I'm getting folks doing this more and more, is just send me a note throughout the week and say, hey, I didn't understand that, or I didn't understand this. And I'll try and answer it directly as best I can. All right.
Could I ask a quick question? This is going to be a kind of a strange one, but is there a dividing line between what's, at least in terms of systems, between what's considered residential versus commercial?
Yes and no. It used to be the dividing line was 10 kW, 10,000 watts. Above that was considered commercial. Below it was considered residential. It's kind of an arbitrary line, but a lot of cities, they charge different fees for permitting for that. I did see that one state just raised it to 15 kW as considered commercial because systems are getting bigger for residential. But that's as good a divider, 10 kW. Most systems for residential are going to be less than 10 kW.
Okay.
And unless you got a McMansion.
Sure. One reason I'm asking is because we're looking at I work for a community college, and we're looking to build a small, relatively small, probably 6 to 8 kW system to power a greenhouse. Can we stick with, because it's a school property, does that make a difference with respect to regulations?
No.
In terms of, okay, no. Just the size of the system?
Yeah, just the size and the usage of the building. It makes no difference. Now, yours would be considered a commercial application, and there are additional benefits to being a commercial install. There's additional incentives that are out there that are available to commercial systems that aren't available to residential. Okay. So you might want to explore some of that because like the REAP grant that's through the USDA is available to commercial, not to residential. Some of the add-ons for the federal tax benefits from the Investment Retirement or the Inflation Reduction Act, I said investment retirement account. Now, is from the IRA are commercial, not residential. Although I did hear a podcast where they're speculating the Made in America thing could be residential as well. So lots of different incentives for commercial activities. And of course you're a nonprofit or a school. So but I would really explore the REAP grant thing because your tax incentives may not be all that exciting because you're nonprofit. But, actually though, with the incentives now with the IRA, you can get them as a rebate. So even though you don't pay taxes, they're now can be utilized by nonprofit entities. So you get your 30% back as a refund from the government, even though you don't pay taxes. So you can get this whole thing practically paid for because the REAP grant is 40%. The IRA base is 30%. Use American products, that's another 10%. If you're in a low income area, that can be another 10%. So right there, now you're up to 90% of the whole thing being paid for. So.
And that REAP grant is how do you spell that? REE?
REAP. It's like
AP.
Renewable Energy for America. Yeah, Renewable Energy for America program. And they'll give you like 40% as a grant. It's through the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture.
Yeah, I was actually just looking at it, and it says for rural small businesses or people who get more than 50% of their income from agricultural products.
Right.
It looks like those are the two big ones.
Yeah, they consider rural any jurisdiction with less than 50,000 people. So a lot of towns that you might not consider rural still are considered rural as far as the government's concerned. So, but
Now-
it is a competitive grant.
Yep.
So it's not guaranteed. You got to apply. They only allocate X number of dollars, but they also like quadrupled the amount of money that's available. So I do assessments for REAP here in Ohio, and the government is basically begging us. We're going out begging people to take the money is essentially what we're doing. So
No, that's for like businesses and such. But do you know of any way of finding more incentives for like smaller residential stuff?
there are some local incentives, and if you happen, if you lived in the state of Illinois, they have a program that will prepay you the RECs for 10 years. So I've seen some solar assessments in Illinois that actually are less than zero cost, where you get a check for installing solar. Sounds like one of those ripoff commercials, but it's really true. you know.
I want to, if you don't mind me interjecting, I work at Intertech and I process SRECs for the state of Illinois. And it is very common to see $20,000 checks going to residential. And also the question he had about how to tell if it's considered residential or commercial, you would need to look at your utility bill to see what it's rated. And most likely you would be commercial. Even if you are under 10K, you would probably still be rated as commercial. So just take a look at that power bill and it should tell you where you stand with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
That might be a good guide. Although when I've done assessments, I've seen some farms and stuff that are truly commercial that are still under like a residential rating system. So, you know, some of those, at least in the rural Ohio, they're not so good at making sure the billing fits the application.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah, unfortunately, I live down in Tennessee, and our company that we serve, or that for electric, I was trying to put a solar setup on my little tiny house, and they ended up telling me that I can't do it unless I paid about another additional $1,000 in permits. And even then, when I actually did get the solar, that they wouldn't do a buyback. So I didn't know if there was any kind of more government incentives or anything like that.
Yeah. This was your local utility company that was the problem. Are you on a rural
Yeah.
electric co-op, or is it like Tennessee Valley?
Yeah.
Or
It's a rural electric co-op. They service about 5 or 6 counties around us.
yeah, you need to go to the annual meeting and raise holy hell because you're an owner, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're on a co-op, and they actually have a pretty good solar policy, but largely because nobody cares. You know, I mean, it's like they'll do full payback up to what I purchase, and then after that they'll pay me wholesale. So, but then they did slap a $40 a month access fee if you have solar. So that was a bit underhanded of them, but
They have it's $35 just to have the meter in general. Not even if you use it, it's $35 to have the meter, and an additional $20 to have the water because they're co-op with power and water. So it's just that's why I was trying to cut all that out and go straight to solar.
yeah, well, are you is that for everybody, or is that if you just have solar?
So that's for everyone. That's before you
Yeah.
do solar.
Yeah, and I mean, that's reasonable if that's their true cost. I mean, that's what I argued with them. Does it cost them that much to give us what they did with our rural electric is they said, if you have solar, it's $40. If you don't, it's $20. And I was like, well, that's kind of underhanded, but you know, so anyway, all right. Well, I think we're pretty much out of time on this, so we'll get together next week. But in the meantime, if you have any questions throughout the week, get in touch and progress on through. We should be
Yep.
getting through chapter 6, I think, already. All right. Take care.
You have a
Bye-bye.
good day.
Enjoy your week.